Now that your pattern is complete, it's time to cast on the back. And I have a few tips I'd like to give you before you do that. First of all, you're going to be using a long tail cast on, partly because that's the one that's most commonly taught, and also because that's a really good cast on for this particular application. You start by making a slip knot. And it's really important to make this loose. That's what I want to tell you first. And the reason is this: if you look at what you're making, and I don't do it the conventional way, I do it, I don't know, I do it the way I learned 100 years ago, and so I wrap that around. Notice that I am making basically two loops. There's a loop in this direction, and then a loop that's on the needles. So that if you don't pull that so that you get an edge that's loose enough, the bottom of your sweater will be too tight. I have seen this. This is the advantage of having worked in a yarn shop, that you see problems that people have that you ordinarily wouldn't see. So if you do it just like this, right up against that, then I don't have a long enough loop there. So just be aware that you want nice, even loops at the bottom. That's tip number one. Tip number two is I'm going to show you how to count your rows of ribbing. Remember when I showed you when you were doing your cast on edge that actually you are making a loop there and then that loop right there. So that first loop, that first quote unquote looks like a row, is actually your cast on. So there's your cast on row, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 6 rows of ribbing here. You are also counting the ones on the needle. So when you measure your 1.5 inches for the back, make sure that you count that row. Whether or not you count the cast on row is up to you. But I don't personally. I just say, okay, there's a cast on row, and then I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows of rib. But as long as you're consistent, if you count it every time, then it doesn't matter. Now, the third thing I want to point out to you is that I always begin my ribs with an odd number, my one by one ribs with an odd number, and I start and end with a knit. And that's because I want to use those knits. I'm going to use a half stitch of each of those end stitches, and I'm going to make it look like it's just one stitch. So it really is nice for finishing. Here's an example of where you actually have to think about finishing before you ever even pick up the needles. But I want to show you this edge. This is the edge that I like for the public side more than I like this edge. This one's a little bit bumpier. It looks more purl-like to me. This looks more finished and knit-like. It's more rope-like. Let's pull that down so you can see it. It has more bumps. So I personally, because I want this to be on the public side, always make my first row a wrong side row after I've done a long tail cast on. Once you've finished your 1.5 inches of rib, you change to your larger needles. Notice that it doesn't even look like it's larger. It actually looks like this might be larger, but this is just the nature of the knit one, purl one rib. And you can increase or decrease along the center here. You'll only have to increase 1 stitch or decrease 1 stitch if it's an even number of stitches that you want to get to. So do it in that very first row or in the last row of your ribbing. That's just fine. And then you knit until you get to your underarm. Here, my back is already completed. I did a complete 34 rows, and then I took a piece of thread and knitted it with my the beginning like 5 stitches and end 5 stitches. Now it didn't come out very well. It didn't do a very good job, but that is enough for me to be able to know where to pick up and knit when it comes time to put my sleeve in. So this is the top row of my bottom of the body. This will be the first row that I pick up to make my sleeves. If you stop and mark this with a thread now that you can snip out later or pull out later, it will be easier than counting the rows, though that's not a big deal either. So go ahead and knit your back all the way up, marking your underarm. And when you get to the top, just put all the stitches on a long circular needle, or you can put them on a piece of thread, anything, but you want to keep these as live stitches because we're going to knit the shoulders together later, and that will be one less seam that you'll have to do. When you finish the back, start the front, and the exact same number of stitches, increase or decrease 1 stitch along this first row if you need to, and knit until the entire piece measures 5.5 inches. And when you get to this point, stop and rejoin me, and we're going to bind off the center stitches and join a new ball of yarn in order to work both fronts at the same time.